Hi everyone and welcome. I'm down here in my wormery. What I have in front of me is a bin that I think is in distress. I featured this bin in a video only a couple days ago, and I believe that the overwhelming reaction by the viewers was to do my best just to get the worms out of the material. What I had actually done here was I had set up a part of the bin with all fresh bedding and stuff so that the worms, hopefully on their own accord, can make their way over into the new stuff. But most people were saying the worms could probably use a little help because the material that they're in right now has sort of turned really muddy and sticky, and the worms are definitely struggling in that material. So I've come back in here to see what I could do about, relocating the worms, getting them out of this old stuff into the new stuff. And at that point, we can pretty much do away with this material on this side of the bin, which is suspected to be tainted in some way. As usual, I glove only one hand. I keep the other hand free so I can manipulate the camera and keep it clean just in case I need to handle something that I don't want to get soiled. Here, you could see little pockets of white dots, and those have got to be the mites crowding around worms that have already at this point met their end. And that's the general reason it's an advantage to have mites in your worm systems, because they do just that. They clean up, whenever there's something that needs cleaning up. And I fear that in this particular case, there's probably a good amount of stuff that needs cleaning up. On this side of the bin, I had laid in a variety of different stuff, primarily leaves that I've been bringing in from outside. And I originally attested the proliferation of mites in my environments to those leaves that I'd been bringing in from outside. So I've been adding an extra step lately to the process so that when I bring the leaves in from outside, it's weird when they crowd together like that. That's usually a sign that they're not content. So the leaves, the process used to just involve me going out and getting the leaves, but I added a step where I would kind of try to cleanse the leaves of any sort of hitchhikers or any sort of insects that might be living in or on the leaves, since I suspected that the leaves were how the mites had gotten into my systems originally. But a lot of people have been throwing around different types of ideas about what could be going wrong, causing the issues within my systems. Some people have been theorizing that the process of microwaving leaves might be contributing to some of the problems. Other people have been suggesting that maybe the water supply in my area is somehow to blame. Perhaps excess chlorine or some other sort of chemicals. Alright, so I guess what I was looking for was some sort of indication that what I've got going on here is actually providing the worms with some relief, and I'm glad to see that when we burrow down into the lower reaches of this fresh bedding that I had set up for them, that there are worms hanging out down there within it. So down beneath this fairly thick layer of leaves on top is some of the food scraps that I had salvaged out of the old material and threw that down into here, as well as all kinds of paper and cardboard, which was the base layer at the very bottom. I'll take a little peek under there. Even at the very lowest reaches, we could see some worms making themselves at home down there. So, I mean, put yourself in my shoes for a minute. If suddenly I've got to start suspecting that the leaves themselves that I'm using as a pretty common source of bedding in my environment, if those are to blame for my issues, then suddenly those are out of the mix. I'm not able to use those anymore. If the water coming out of my tap is suddenly to blame, then all of a sudden I'm really growing very limited to the sort of stuff that I can use. So, trying to keep all that in mind, I've been taking cardboard, I've been shredding up cardboard. I've got a watering can that's got some water in it that I placed in there many days ago. So the whole idea behind letting water sit before using it in your worm bins is to allow any chlorine that might be within the water to evaporate away, because chlorine will evaporate out of your water in time. So if you've got very chlorinated water, one possible solution is to just let it sit for a few days before using it in your worm bins. I'm getting the sense that the environment that I've provided for these worms is probably nothing to be too worried about. I didn't want to just assume that it's fine, because some people have actually suggested create an entirely new space for them, get them out of this material here, but then, you know, forget about this stuff over here too. But I really didn't want to forget about this stuff over here, because I just want to have a little bit of faith in the fact that my leaves are okay, regardless of the fact that I've been microwaving them before bringing them in here, even though some people have thrown around the theory that that might be a contributing factor to some of the problems I've been experiencing. So I don't know, I've got this idea that I've got to sort of start eliminating things one at a time after I can more or less confirm that they're in fact a problem, or at least come up with some sort of good substantiating evidence to indicate that they're a problem. I mean, otherwise I'm really severely limiting myself on my options on what I can and I can't do. So I've just wanted to sort of inspect how the new domain is on this side of the bin before getting comfortable with the idea of actually using it going forward, and I'm fairly convinced that there's not a problem here. Worms have made their way down into it. They've congregated around some of the old food items that I've put in here. They made their way down to the bottom of it. They were hanging out on the top surface of it. So I think that what we've got going on is fine over here. So, you know, please, if you're one of the people who've been, you know, a proponent of me just scrapping this side as well, please don't take it the wrong way, but I've really got to sort of take little baby steps towards arriving at conclusions as to what my problems are and what's causing them. I just don't really feel like I've got the luxury to, you know, take wholesale approaches to scrapping some of the things that I rely on to do my worm composting. So I guess this is kind of what I was really hoping to avoid, is the tedium of needing to pick through this material to individually remove the worms from it and get them out of this stuff. But if we want to get rid of this stuff, and you know, I am satisfied with the theory that whatever it is that's causing this material to get clumpy like this and sticky is, you know, got many reasons. Number one is me letting it get too wet, possibly contributed to by me keeping plastic coverings on the bins. Number two is maybe overfeeding, insufficient amount of bedding, once again something that I have control over. But another thing that people have been suggesting is that you know, supporting that whole theory of it being tainted, is that there might be some sort of bacteria within the material, a type of bacteria that really utilizes a vast amount of moisture and sucks the moisture out of the system exceedingly fast, making the material kind of clumpy and muddy the way we see it here. So I don't know why, but I have no evidence to really point to that theory, but it just seems so sensible that maybe there is something in here. And I believe that that theory is something that a number of people believe is very plausible, because, you know, you keep hearing about a lot of people suggesting that the cross-contamination consideration is one to not underestimate. And some of the, you know, some of the people who I put the greatest amount of confidence in when they give me advice on my worm composting have suggested that same thing. And, you know, I just, see, I mean, this poor worm just does not seem like it's still alive. So I feel like I'm going to encounter certain pockets where I'm just going to see a good number of worms that didn't make it, unfortunately. So I apologize if some people consider this to be a little bit graphic, but just going back to the concept of cross-contamination and how some of the more trusted voices that I do like to take advice from out there, I guess I'm just going to sort of take a leap of faith here that maybe you know, I have a chance of sort of outrunning whatever it is that's contaminating this side by maybe creating a good large bedding rich environment over on this side, and hopefully not having whatever it is that could possibly be contaminating my material take a foothold over here too. Naturally, I have no, you know, nothing to explain how that's going to occur other than me being faithful in the hopes that that will happen that way. But I mean, the option would have been to actually remove every worm from both sides of this bin and somehow you cleanse them before putting them into a brand new, clean, fresh environment. And, you know, if you think that this is tedious and time consuming, then I can only imagine how much time that would occupy. So I'm very reluctant to take that route unless it seems like it's the only way out. And it's not, you know, I don't know, I'm not trying to be cold or ruthless. I'm just trying to be pragmatic. So and I guess I'm just kind of willing to assume a certain degree of risk, and that might seem a little bit cold too, because ultimately I'm assuming the risk, but the real, you know, the brunt of the negative effect, if the risk should become realized, is the poor worms. So I've kind of got to take a little bit of a leap of faith that I'm going to be okay by taking this course of action. So I've only kind of scratched the surface here as far as I'm concerned. I've got a fair bit of picking through the material to do, but I just wanted to get a little bit of footage here in the beginning and explain what I'm doing. I believe what I'm going to do next is bring over a container into which I could place material that I feel like I've screened already, so I can gradually begin just moving it out of this container. So let me go get another box that I can start putting this stuff into once I feel like I've already removed all the worms, and then I'll continue. So here I have a container that's probably about half the capacity of this bus box that the bin is currently set up in, and it should be adequate for me to position all of this stuff after I've had a chance to inspect it. And I think the last step I'm probably going to do before I write off all of this material is maybe actually just soak it through and allow, if there are still any worms maybe nested down within the material, maybe the worms will kind of float out onto the surface of the water, and then I can salvage just a few more of them. But I mean, when I've got a clump of material like this, I just don't know if there's maybe a worm in it. But then again, it does seem extremely unlikely. I think if I just sort of establish a theory that maybe the material is stuff that the worms just wouldn't even want to be within, then I should just assume that if there's a material like this, a clump of material with no worms visible sticking out of it, it's probably safe to assume that there's no worms down within it. So it's very likely that I might just take that theory and run with it. But I mean, there's no harm in just maybe, you know, filling this container up over here with water after I've got all that somewhat tainted material loaded into there. And who knows, maybe some worms will float to the surface, I'm not sure. But it does seem like if I break any of these chunks of material, these clumpy, sticky, damp chunks open, I don't really see worms within them. I see worms cruising around in between these chunks. And it makes complete sense that the worms are not happy because, you know, this stuff is just taking up so much space in their bin, and the only place that they have to be is the small spaces in between these large clumps. And then any time you get a couple of these large clumps fused together, suddenly whatever little space might have existed between them is lost as well. So it does seem like the real estate in the bin rapidly diminishes to virtually nothing when the material starts to get this way, because the worms clearly don't want to be within it. Even when there's a piece of material stuck within the stuff, like this, which I believe is the stem of a banana, which is a type of object that the worms would normally be really interested in hanging out around, but all this material is just turning them off. So it does seem very realistic to assume that every one of these clumps that I'm removing has no worms in it. So it's a little bit of extra peace of mind knowing that I'm not throwing any worms out of the wormery by writing off each of these clumps of material. But I mean, even a clump this big, it's huge. But I would have to assume that if I start tearing it into bits, breaking it apart, regardless of what type of a tasty morsel of food or cozy chunk of bedding it might be made up of, it's the gooey, sticky, overly damp castings sticking to everything is turning it into kind of a no man's land, a place where worms just don't want to go or be. So I'm going to take my time. I'm not going to try to rush through this. I'd really like to try to save as many worms as I can before I write this material off as trash. So I'm going to continue with this and we'll check back later. So I have been at this for a few minutes and I haven't really found a lot of worms inhabiting these chunks. Like here, for example, is one worm. Seems to be pretty lively and healthy, but it's a real tiny baby worm. So obviously I'm going to rescue the little guy. But I just can't seem to help drawing a parallel to what I'm seeing here to the types of stories I read when I was a kid. When I was a kid, I was really into dinosaurs, and as I find a worm that seems to be struggling to move within this material, I can't help myself but be reminded of those images in those books where the dinosaurs are stuck in tar pits. Somehow a dinosaur ends up in a tar pit, and then it just can't seem to move, and then ultimately what ends up happening with that dinosaur is that it, you know, perishes within that tar, and then today the archaeologists find the remains of that deceased dinosaur in the form of a fossil. And it does seem like these poor worms are on the brink of meeting a similar fate of, you know, not being able to move eventually when they find themselves within this stuff. Because it is just so gooey, and I've definitely found a fair number of worms that, you know, look like they were just stuck within the stuff and were already past the point of being able to be rescued out of here. Like here's a cocoon. I suppose if I find a cocoon it would make sense to keep it as well. But that's actually the first one I've spotted along the way. Maybe I just haven't been paying close enough attention. I should really see if I can also reclaim cocoons if I see any in here. But I can certainly see a lot of them being kind of stuck inside of clumps of material like this, and those are just going to be history at this point, unfortunately. Not much I could do about anything that's trapped within a pile of this stuff. Let's see if I can upturn some of this stuff over here. Maybe there's a better number of worms right on the edge along the plastic that went there in the hopes of getting away from this material. Perhaps because the plastic is a more forgiving stuff to move around next to. It does seem like down along the surface of the plastic there are worms to be rescued. And unfortunately other worms that just look like they're already past that point. The poor things. Alright. As I'm inspecting this material, I'm reminded of some stuff that people mentioned in the comments about the leaves that I had put in here, thinking that, you know, hey, a whole bunch of bedding would be the solution. And maybe it was the right answer. Maybe if I had used the right type of bedding, it would have been a completely different result. Because the leaves that I put in here really did not help at all. The whole idea was to create little gaps and voids, little pockets of air, maybe, along with some dry bedding material that could suck up the moisture. But the leaves maybe did suck up some of the moisture, but provided no relief in terms of creating little voids and cavities that the worms could move through or retreat into. Had I used cardboard, possibly, it might have contributed to the, you know, absorption of some of the moisture in this material, which is certainly excessive. But perhaps within the corrugated folds, if I had used corrugated cardboard, for example, perhaps that in itself, just based on its structure, could have provided some of these worms a place to retreat into and not get stuck. And as you can see, I'm definitely making my way to the end of this stack of material here. Luckily, finding worms that are still moving and still alive and can be rescued, but unfortunately finding a great number of them that are already past that point. So I am glad when I find a little pocket of worms that I've somehow managed to evade death by maybe huddling together or just finding a spot where they can survive, but regrettably there are a huge number of them that just did not make it. So while I probably could have acted sooner to give these worms some relief, I'm still glad that I'm doing something that is enabling the preservation of some of them at least. There's something in this chunk of material that these mites are ravaging over, and I don't know what it is. It might be a chunk of fruit or something, some sort of a really tasty morsel. And these are those fast-moving mites, the little dark-colored ones, as opposed to the white mites that are really slow movers. So I've got a little bit more picking to do here, and hopefully I could still find a few more worms that I can save. But I think I'm close to the end here. I think we'll be done soon. So as I make my way to the end of this material, you can see that there's very little left. And I continue to try to break each chunk apart into at least a few pieces to see if I can dislodge any other little worms that could be possibly nested within the material. Unfortunately, the only thing I find when I break something open and there's a worm in there is a dead worm. It's very unlikely to find a living worm stuffed within any of this material. It's not the type of a material that the living worms would be able to survive in, it seems. It does seem like if they get caught within this stuff and it restricts their mobility, it's pretty much a death sentence. So I had thought about taking this material outside and kind of seeing if I could dissolve away all of the material, all the sticky, gooey stuff, and maybe dislodge all the individual chunks of bedding and food scraps and everything that there might be in here, in the hopes that I might be able to still unearth a few more worms from this material. But I believe that would be a futile effort at this point. I believe just from observing what I saw, picking through each of these chunks as I went searching for survivors, I don't feel that there would be any surviving worms nested within any of these chunks of material. So I think I'm just going to scrap that whole idea of trying to soak all of that material to see if I can find any more worms within it. It just doesn't seem likely whatsoever. I mean, if there was even a little bit of hope, any chance of that being likely, I would give it a try, but it just doesn't seem to me like it would be worth an effort, because I don't think there's any chance of worms surviving within that material. So they're not terribly lively, but the worms that I was able to, let's bring it back in here a little bit. The worms that I was able to rescue, I just kept stacking them up on top here. My hope is that they're going to be able to make their way down into the bedding. I guess I'm going to have to figure out what to do with this next here. I mean, technically this is still the same bin with the same inhabitants, even though the number of inhabitants have significantly been reduced. So this is still a 70-some-odd day old bin, with just pretty much a swap out of the material, with all the, all the material that seems to have just gone bad extracted, with a fresh load of material thrown in here for the worms. I did spend some time tearing up some cardboard, so it's jammed in here pretty tight, so it is a significant amount of cardboard. And I put my recycling out this morning, but I did salvage some of the more the types of newspaper bits that seemed like they were not the glossy type paper, the regular newspaper circulars for the supermarkets and stuff. I thought that maybe by combining some of this cardboard here and maybe seeing if I can get my shredder to possibly fragment some of that newspaper up, and maybe even allocating some of my little bit of remaining COCO core that I've got, maybe I can also create a little bit more of a comfortable mix of materials for these worms and try to build up their environment a little bit. So I think that might be the next step for trying to restore some sort of a comfortable environment for these worms to reside in. So for now, I think we're still going to keep this bin as what it originally was, which is the bin that we launched on the 29th of March, and continue the day counter moving forward, and treat the the events that led up to this situation here as something to learn from, and hopefully something to base our future decisions on and maybe make improvements on. But I believe that a whole bunch of fresh bedding, bedding that's going to much outweigh the amount of food that's in the material that's thrown into the bin. I'm going to try to put a greater emphasis on making sure that any feeding always includes a corresponding amount of bedding, probably in a greater ratio than I've done in the past. Sometimes the bedding just seems to go in there as sort of a token, or as just a just sort of a showpiece sprinkled in on top of the food. But it does seem like if the food's going to go in, the bedding's got to go in much greater quantities, orders of magnitude greater than the amount of food that you're putting in there, with the knowledge that that bedding is also going to eventually end up as food for the worms too. So I think that's kind of the firefight that I wanted to embark on today, and there's a good amount of stuff that I've got to still do here, which is not really video worthy. I'm going to discard all that material that we plucked out of here, maybe just place it out in the garden in the hopes that maybe it provides any sort of surviving worms that might still be in the material a way to possibly escape and make their way out into nature. And obviously any cocoons that are in that material may be an opportunity to still hatch and also survive. I just don't see the sense in keeping the stuff around knowing that it's full of worm corpses. It's just going to become stinky, and I just don't want to have it around here. And also, if there's a possibility that it's loaded with some sort of a bacteria that could be causing problems, I'm all for getting it as distant from the rest of my worms as possible. And I got some other cleaning up and putting away to take care of here too, but since that's boring, I'm not going to waste your time with that. I'm going to leave it at that for today. So that's where we stand today with this bin. Hopefully we've taken the right steps here to give these worms a second chance at a comfortable, happy life going forward. I know we've diminished the the head count in this bin significantly. I believe that the original estimate for this bin was somewhere in the neighborhood of about maybe 800 worms. At this point, who knows where we stand. We've probably lost a great quantity of worms in this process. So hopefully we could limp back to restoring a population of worms in here that's happy and healthy and able to reproduce and restore their numbers back to a respectable amount. So we'll see where that leads. All right, everyone. Thanks so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, even though it wasn't that enjoyable. But it is what it is. It's life. All right, everyone. Thanks for watching. Please remember to leave me a thumbs up if you think it was a good video. You know, if you think all I deserve is a thumbs down, then feel free to give me that too. I deserve it. Sometimes I feel like I do deserve it. All right, everyone. Have a great day. Thanks again for watching. Bye-bye.